So here we are, right at the beginning of the Revelations of Divine Love. And what I wanted to give you in way of introduction was, what is this text that we're actually reading? What are we reading? So it's a bit of a history and a bit of a story behind the text. And I think understanding what we're reading makes us sit more lightly to the actual words that we're reading in a translation, because obviously a translator has interpreted the text, the Middle English text, and gives us their understanding of that text. So it helps us to sit a little bit more lightly to that and not treat the text as we would scripture, looking at every word. It helps us just to realize that there is a lot that lies behind what Barry Windiett has done. So first of all, it's really important to say, I'm sure many of you already know, that there are actually two versions of Revelations of Divine Love. The text itself, the manuscript, never gave it that title at all. That's a title that later editors gave to it. And you'll find with different editors that they'll give it a different title. So some call it, like Marion Glasgow will call it a revelation of love, or some, which is what I follow, revelations of divine love. Lots of different, or vision to a person called Julian. So there are lots of different titles for it, which gives us an idea that this is a text which we know, but we don't actually know that much about. Okay, so there's a shorter text and then there's a longer text. Now, the shorter text, when was it written? Well, we think that the shorter text was probably written in just after the visions, when Julian had her visions, probably in about the 10 or probably 10 or 15 years after she had her revelation of divine love, which happened, as we know, on the 8th of May, 1373. Now, the reason that we surmise that is because it's a much shorter version, first of all. It emphasizes much more the showings themselves, or the visions, whatever language you want to use to describe them. And also, it just gives some initial kind of interpretation of them. If you sit it next to the long text, it's immediately clear that one is a first draft, in a sense, and the second, this is the produce of someone who's really thought about their writings, really thought about what happened all those years ago. So that's where we usually place the short text. Now, the original manuscript, I'm afraid we don't really have, but we do have a version of it within one manuscript, which is called the Amherst manuscript, and it dates from around circa 1500. So it's one of the earliest of Julian's texts that we have. Now, the other text is called the long text, and of course, it's the long text because it's much longer. It's nearly twice the length, and when you come to, you realize that the showings are there, but they're much more embedded within this whole sense of interpretation and musing and contemplation and understanding that she puts down on manuscript. Much longer. Oops, let me just admit Cindy. Again, we really don't have many manuscripts for this text. We only really have about 3 major manuscripts, so only 3 copies of it. The first is held in the British Library. It's called Sloane 1, and that dates from around 1650, so the middle of the 17th century. It's the one which editors or English scholars like myself really go to, because it's the one which retains most of the medieval language. because all of these manuscripts will have been updated, modernized, changed around by scribes to make them much more accessible and relevant, I guess, to the people that they were writing the manuscript out for. There's another one which follows on from Sloane 1, and this is called Sloane 2. It's called Sloane 2. It's also in the British Library, but that's because it's really clear that actually Sloane 2 is a copy of Sloane 1. But it's, as I say, it's very redacted, or many of the medieval words are taken out or they're modernized again. So it's a much lesser sort of a version, and most people don't really use it. The other one, which is used quite a lot by editors, is the Paris one. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And there we find a different kind of stream to the Sloane, because it has some passages which you don't find in the in Sloane 1. And that's quite interesting. So it gives you the sense that maybe there was another original sort of manuscript way back, and that some bits have been taken out and some bits have been changed. And what we have is the resulting two manuscripts that show two traditions of this text. A lot of people, therefore, as I say, editors will take the Paris manuscript as their base text for translation. So people like Nicholas Watson, who's a very eminent Julian scholar, his edition is based on the Paris. So when you come to the text of Julian, you need to be quite aware of what you're actually reading. Is it from the Sloane tradition, or is it from the Paris edition? As I say, I prefer to go down the Sloane because it keeps those medieval words. So what this is basically saying to us is that it's really clear that actually we don't have an original text. At best, we have a copy of a copy. Even the Paris manuscript doesn't date until the 16th century. So we have copies of copies of copies. There's one other area that we find some text of Julian, and that is in a few fragments. There are two areas, two manuscripts. One is the Westminster fragments, which is in the treasury of Westminster Abbey, and the other is the Up Holland manuscript. Now, both of these are compilation texts. So basically, you have a religious community, or you have someone who's very devout, who basically takes all the extracts that they like from different texts and they put them all together. What it does show to us is that Julian, some passages of Julian are embedded within a whole sequence of writings who we know. So like Walter Hilton, The Cloud of Unknowing, Richard Rolle. So it shows that this person has been collecting all the kind of contemplative writing and put them together so that they can get this kind of understanding what the contemplative life is like. And of course, that's why today we often lump this group of writers together and say they're the English mystics. They would never have called themselves the English mystics or the school of English mystics. That's something which we have later put onto them, mainly because of the way that people have brought all those texts together and said, this is the kind of contemplative writing of the latter 14th century. So those are the base manuscripts that we have. Now, if we return to the long text, when was the long text written? Because that's the text that we're reading tonight. And that's the text which most people, when they're talking about the revelations of divine love, that's the text they're talking to. Well, again, we have no idea when it was written. We don't have an original manuscript. So how on earth do we know? Well, we know that it would have been after the actual visions that she received in 1373. It probably is after writing this short text. There is one big clue that helps us, and that is in the long text, we have this chapter 51, which lots of people know about. And in this chapter 51, we are given what's known as an example which answers Julian's concerns about why she sees no wrath in God, and why he looks on us as if we were as clean as the holy angels in heaven. It's very, very beautiful. And it's a very long chapter, but it's not in the short text. Now, she tells us right at the beginning that she received this example in answer to prayer 20 years after she had received the initial showings of 1373. So we can date that. The earliest that that text could be is 1393, 20 years after. And it's very unlikely that she would have immediately had the example and then rushed off and written the long text. So we probably date it again post 1393. Now that leads me on to a really interesting question of how did Julian write these texts? Did she actually write them herself? Well, again, we're not really sure. What we do know is at that time that people could probably read more often than they could write. So back in the medieval period, that the two R's, reading and writing, were not linked together as they are today. Writing and reading were two quite different things. Now, often those people who were landed, had education, would be able to read. But writing was seen as something which was a much more professional skill, because it needed manuscript preparation, it needed the preparing of the writing, it needed the time to be able to write. So we're not talking about the kind of paper that we have now, which can sort of be scribbled on and thrown away. We're talking about vellum, which obviously would take quite a lot to prepare and then to write on. So it's possible that Julian could know how to read, but she didn't know how to write. Now, one of the reasons that we think she may have been able to write was twofold. The first is that there has been some really convincing arguments to say that Julian, when she had her revelations, was not a nun in a religious order, but actually was living at home. And also that she was probably, well, of the more of the, not of the gentry class, but much more of the upper middle class, the new mercantile class that was really coming into its own. And then she lost her family in the plague, in the great pandemic of the plague. And then it was after that that later she went into the anchor hold. So she's actually a sort of a semi-noble, educated lady who's living at home when she receives. Now, it's really likely that that kind of a woman would have been able to write, just to be able to control the household affairs. And we have evidence of women writing at that echelon of society. So it's possible that Julian was able to write. The second bit of evidence that kind of points us towards that way is that many of the visionary writers at the time, they couldn't write, and so they had what's known as amanuensis, which is basically they had a secretary to write it all down for them. Now, when we come to Julian's text, there is no hint at all that anyone is writing down her text. There's no hint of another voice that comes in and might amend or change. Even dealing with a manuscript that is, you know, if the 16th, 17th century, we still don't get that impression of a third voice. There's a kind of immediacy to her text, which gives us a real sense that we're hearing Julian's words and no intervening writer at all. So it gives us a really strong argument to say that Julian actually did write a text. Another area which has been increasingly taken on board by scholars, which is a really interesting area of study at the moment, is that Julian didn't write her book. So she didn't sit down and say, right, I'm going to write it. There you are. And it's going off for publication and dissemination, like an author would today. But actually that it was a text that she continued to return to time on time on time again. She kept coming back and changing and modifying and updating and adding bits in and modifying her text all the way through. That says something really important to how Julian views the text that we're going to read. So she's viewing it, if this is true, she's viewing it very much as a spiritual exercise in itself. So she has contemplated what she has seen, and then the fruit of that contemplation is then being written down. So the actual way of contemplating is actually through the written word. The closest we come to today is something like a spiritual journal. So those of you who keep a spiritual journal will know that actually the process of writing actually calls forth what you are spiritually thinking and feeling. And actually, if you weren't asked to write it or you weren't compelled to write it, then actually maybe those things would stay hidden. It's a bit like when we see a spiritual director or we will talk to someone about a spiritual life. The act of actually talking makes us realize and understand. So that's possibly comparable with the way Julian is actually writing her text. I find that utterly a convincing argument when we start looking at Julian's text and when we start thinking about how much it enables us to pray, but also how convoluted and how it changes and develops, and how simple words can suddenly become theological words, how she develops themes and then goes back to them, that this is a person who is living and breathing and praying through writing her text. So what happened to her text? Why is it that we only have relatively, well, really, we only have about three manuscripts. That's really not very many. So what happened? Well, we know that Julian certainly had an idea that she wanted the vision. She had a sense that her vision wasn't just for her, but that it was for, as she said, mine even Christians. So we have this sense that there is an audience out there for whom she is writing. And that comes across quite clearly in the long text as she shifts the mode of audience from the short text to the long text. So in the short text, she very much addresses what she calls contemplatives. So as we know from Cloud of Unknowing, those are very kind of specialized or limited group of people who are following the contemplative life, like her. And then she opens it up much more and speaks to mine even Christian. So we have this sense of an opening up. But why did it not get any further? Well, we really can't answer that question. Again, there are lots of questions. We do know that that in 1415, the Archbishop at the time, Archbishop Arundel, had a real clampdown on his authority in the church. partly because he wanted to bring a lot of priests into line to check that they were doing, but he made a number of very clear statutes that may have had effect on someone like Julian. For example, the women could not teach in church. Now, Julian, she tries to get around that and say, I'm not a teacher, but her text is very much one of revealing and showing and guiding if it's not theological teaching. Also, we find that at this time, pretty much all that kind of mystical writing, writing of the visionaries pretty much starts to dry up. Now, it may be because of the Lollard heresy, that actually speaking out, using your imagination, having different views from the church was actually stamped out. And we know that a number of people were burnt as heretics, even in Norwich. So there's a very loud clarion cry from the church that if you wanted to be saved, it was through the church. And that these other groups who spoke very eloquently about their faith in God were seen as maybe a threat, or were much more scared about speaking out. But Julian's text pretty much went underground, and those manuscripts that I spoke of were only really held by a number of very small religious communities, the Cambrai nuns over in Paris, and also the person called Augustine Baker, who started to actually bring her text, Julian's text, to the surface. But it wasn't really until the early part of the 20th century that Grace Warwick did her first translation of the Revelations of Divine Love. And since then, it has pretty much taken off, because so many people have realized that this is really a wonderful text, and it gives us so many insights, not only in how in our relationship with God, but actually really speaks of God's love for us. And I'm sure that, like me, you find that completely compelling and rings true to what we experience in our lives today.